Civilizations rise, expand, and vanish with such regularity that collapse almost feels routine. Cities grow where none existed before. Writing appears. Trade stretches across continents. Power concentrates. Then, without warning in the historical record, everything thins. Streets empty, scripts disappear, systems reset. What follows is not always violence or catastrophe. Often, it is quiet. This documentary explores why that pattern repeats so consistently across human history. Not through legends or moral lessons, but through archaeology, climate records, settlement layers, and the slow evidence left in soil and stone. Each chapter traces one pressure at a time: environment, resources, power, belief, population, until a larger picture emerges. Civilizations do not end because of one mistake. They restart because complexity itself has limits. This is not a story about failure. It is a study of how human societies reorganize when those limits are reached. The quiet reset written into human time. Archaeology often begins with layers. One culture sits above another. A road cuts through an older wall. A temple rests on foundations built for something else. These overlaps are not rare. They appear in almost every region where humans lived long enough to leave stone, clay, or soil behind. What is rare is continuity. Civilizations rarely grow in a straight line. They stop, they thin, they restart. The idea of progress suggests accumulation. Tools improve. Knowledge expands, cities grow larger and more complex, yet the ground tells a different story. In many places, advanced systems appear, disappear, and are later rebuilt in simpler forms. Writing vanishes, engineering regresses, trade collapses into local exchange. These resets are not always violent. Some occur quietly. In Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk reached a population of more than 40,000 by around 3,200 BCE. It had administrative tablets, standardized weights, and large-scale construction. By 3000 BCE, much of this structure faded. Writing continued, but urban life shrank. Surrounding regions reverted to smaller settlements. The cause is still debated. Climate records show increasing aridity. River courses shifted. There is no single event recorded that explains the change. A similar pattern appears in the Indus Valley. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, active around 2600 BCE, displayed advanced drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, and planned streets. Around 1900 BCE, these systems were abandoned. The cities were not burned. There is little evidence of invasion. People seem to have left gradually. Later, communities reused bricks without replicating the planning. Writing disappeared entirely. No bilingual texts exist to explain why. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE erased palace economies across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant. Linear B writing ceased. Trade networks spanning hundreds of miles broke apart. Populations declined sharply. For centuries, Greece left almost no written records. Homer's epics emerged long after the collapse, preserved orally. When writing returned, it did so in a different form, adapted from Phoenician scripts. The Maya lowlands present another reset. Between 250 and 900 CE, cities like Tikal, Copan, and Calakmul erected monuments, tracked calendars, and recorded dynastic histories in stone. Around the 9th century, many southern cities were abandoned. Stelae stopped being erected, fields returned to forest. Northern centres continued, but the political structure shifted. Drought cycles have been identified. Yet drought alone does not explain the precision with which inscription dates cease. In each case, later cultures often did not understand what came before. They inherited ruins without instructions. Roman writers visiting Britain encountered stone circles whose builders were unknown even then. Medieval Europeans reused Roman roads and aqueducts while lacking the engineering knowledge to reproduce them at scale. The past became a source of material, not understanding. Geological data adds another layer. Ice cores from Greenland show abrupt climate shifts occurring within decades. The event around 8,200 years ago caused sudden cooling across the northern hemisphere. Earlier, the Younger Dryas, beginning around 12,900 years ago, interrupted post-glacial warming. These changes altered rainfall, vegetation, and migration patterns. Human societies adapted or fractured depending on scale and flexibility. Some resets are visible only through absence. In China, early Bronze Age cultures such as Erlitou, dated to around 1900 BCE, show complex metallurgy and urban planning. Later dynasties preserved myths of earlier sage kings, but lacked direct records. The transition between Xia, Shang, and Zhou is layered with legend, suggesting a memory of disruption without clarity. Written records themselves can create the illusion of continuity. Dynasties record their own legitimacy. They rarely document systemic failure. When records stop, historians must rely on pollen data, isotope analysis, and settlement patterns. Silence becomes evidence. Occasionally, a text hints at awareness of decline. The Sumerian king list mentions cities being struck down and kingship being taken elsewhere. Egyptian records describe periods of chaos between kingdoms. In the Ipuwer papyrus, likely composed around the Middle Kingdom, the text describes famine, disorder, and social inversion. Whether literal or literary, it reflects an expectation that order can collapse. Technological complexity does not guarantee resilience. Highly specialized systems depend on stable inputs. Irrigation requires maintenance. Bureaucracy depends on literacy. Long-distance trade relies on political trust. When one component fails, others follow. Smaller societies may persist longer because they require less coordination. Archaeologists increasingly focus on thresholds, population density, energy use, soil depletion, water management. When systems cross certain limits, recovery becomes harder. Collapse does not mean extinction. It means simplification. Skills narrow, knowledge fragments. What remains may not support rebuilding at the same level. One odd pattern appears repeatedly. Later societies often attribute the ruins they inherit to gods or giants. The builders are imagined as other than human. This suggests a psychological gap as much as a technical one. If the knowledge were fully lost, explanation shifts to myth. Stone becomes sacred when its method is forgotten. The resets do not follow a global clock. They are staggered. While one region declines, another may rise. Yet over long spans, no civilization appears exempt. Each reaches a peak, then thins, then reorganizes. The reasons vary. The pattern remains. Modern civilization, with its global systems, differs in scale but not structure. It depends on climate stability, energy flow, and information transfer. Archaeology does not predict outcomes. It records tendencies. The ground shows that restarts are common, understanding is rare, and continuity is fragile. The chapter continues with the observation that when rebuilding occurs, it rarely begins where it ended. New systems emerge with altered values, tools, and limits. The previous world becomes a buried reference point rather than a foundation. Climate moves first, people follow later. Climate change rarely announces itself in a way that is immediately understood. It does not arrive as a single moment that can be marked on a calendar. It unfolds through small shifts that accumulate over time. Seasons arrive slightly earlier or later. Rains fail one year, then return weakly the next. Winters last longer than expected. Heat settles where it did not before. For early civilizations, these changes were not recorded by instruments or graphs. They were noticed through crop failure, altered migration of animals, shrinking water sources, and rivers that no longer behaved as they once had. By the time written records describe crisis, the conditions behind it had often been present for generations. Modern paleoclimate research shows that Earth's climate does not remain stable unless forced to do so. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica preserve tiny air bubbles trapped in ancient ice. These bubbles allow scientists to measure past temperatures and atmospheric gases with precision. The data reveals repeated episodes of rapid climate change. Some shifts occurred over centuries, others over decades. Stability is the exception, not the rule. One of the clearest examples is the Younger Dryas, which began around 12,900 years ago. After the last ice age had started to retreat, temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped sharply. Glaciers advanced again. Rainfall patterns changed. This cold period lasted for more than 1,000 years. Human communities that had begun to rely on predictable warming conditions were forced to adjust once more. In the Near East, the Natufian culture had developed semi-sedentary settlements supported by wild cereals and seasonal hunting. Archaeological evidence shows that, as the climate cooled and dried during the Younger Dryas, these communities faced increasing stress. Some settlements were abandoned, others changed their subsistence strategies. Grinding stones increased in number, suggesting greater reliance on plant processing. Some researchers argue that the earliest forms of agriculture emerged not from abundance, but from instability. Cultivation may have been a response to unreliable natural food sources. As societies grew larger and more complex, climate variability carried greater consequences. Around 2200 BCE, a widespread aridification event affected much of the Eastern Hemisphere. Evidence from lake sediments, dust deposits, and isotope analysis indicates a sharp reduction in rainfall across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus region. This period coincides with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Administrative centers were abandoned. Trade networks broke down. Written records from the period describe famine and unrest. Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin recorded that the gods had turned against the land. He described enemies appearing where none had existed before. From a modern perspective, these accounts align with environmental stress. Reduced rainfall would have lowered agricultural output, weakened food storage systems, and disrupted long-distance trade. The empire's centralized structure left it vulnerable when surplus failed. Egypt experienced similar strain. The Old Kingdom depended on the Nile's annual flood, which deposited fertile silt across agricultural fields. During this period, flood levels became irregular. Some years brought insufficient water. Others arrived too late to support crops. Records from the First Intermediate Period describe hunger and political fragmentation. Power shifted away from the central state toward local officials who controlled remaining resources. Climate did not destroy Egyptian society outright. It eroded the foundation on which centralized authority depended. In the Indus Valley, climate stress produced a different outcome. Cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had been built around predictable river systems and seasonal monsoons. Paleoriver studies show that the Gaga-Hakra river system gradually lost flow as monsoon patterns shifted. Rather than a sudden collapse, the Indus civilization underwent a long reorganization. Urban centers were slowly abandoned. Populations moved east and south toward more reliable water sources. Standardized brick sizes disappeared. Writing ceased. The society continued in altered form, but its urban system did not return. In the Americas, the Maya lowlands provide another example of climate acting ahead of visible collapse. Lake sediment cores from the Yucatan Peninsula record multiple droughts between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. These droughts coincide with the cessation of monument inscriptions in major cities. The Maya depended on rainfall stored in reservoirs and managed landscapes. Prolonged droughts reduced agricultural yields and undermined the authority of rulers whose legitimacy rested on ensuring balance and abundance. Political systems fragmented, populations dispersed into smaller communities. Climate stress rarely affects entire regions equally. Coastal zones may retain moisture while inland areas dry. Highlands can remain productive while lowlands fail. This uneven pressure fractures political systems. Regions with surplus may resist collapse longer, while others empty out. Archaeological layers often show evidence of migration rather than mass death. People tend to move before conditions become unlivable. One recurring pattern is delay. Climate indicators shift first. Social systems respond later. Drought may begin decades before cities are abandoned. Flood failures may recur for generations before central authority collapses. This lag makes causation difficult to identify in historical sources. Ancient writers described invasion, moral decay, or divine punishment. Rainfall patterns were not recorded as data. The environmental trigger remains invisible in the texts. Ancient societies lacked a concept of climate systems. Weather was interpreted through religious frameworks. Hittite tablets from the Late Bronze Age record prayers and rituals requesting rain during prolonged droughts. Around 1200 BCE, pollen records show a decline in cereal agriculture across Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. This period aligns with the broader Bronze Age collapse. Trade networks that depended on surplus grain failed. States that relied on imported food could no longer support armies or administrators. In China, climate variability influenced dynastic stability. Tree ring data indicates increased frequency of droughts and floods during the late Tang dynasty in the 9th century CE. These environmental stresses coincided with widespread rebellion and population decline. The Anlushan rebellion occurred during a period of disrupted agricultural output. While political decisions played a role, climate amplified existing tensions by reducing the state's ability to supply grain and maintain order. Climate change also affects disease patterns. Shifts in temperature and rainfall alter the habitats of insects and rodents that carry pathogens. Some historians suggest links between climatic anomalies and outbreaks of plague or other epidemics. Skeletal remains from periods of decline often show signs of nutritional stress and disease. While direct causation is difficult to prove, climate instability increases vulnerability. Soil degradation is another long-term factor. During stable periods, societies intensify land use, forests are cleared, fields are expanded. When climate conditions change, degraded soil recovers slowly or not at all. On Easter Island, erosion layers suggest that deforestation, combined with variable rainfall, reduced agricultural capacity. When margins disappeared, the society could not sustain itself at previous levels. Unlike earthquakes or floods, climate change rarely leaves a clear destruction layer. Its traces are subtle: reduced pollen counts, increased dust deposits, changes in animal remains. These signals require modern scientific methods to detect. Ancient populations experienced the effects without understanding the cause. The stress accumulated quietly. Adaptation is possible, but limited by scale. Small communities can relocate or change subsistence strategies. Large urban systems are anchored to infrastructure. Canals, roads, and fields cannot move easily. When environments shift, flexibility decreases. Collapse appears sudden only because adaptation has already failed. Climate does not act alone. It interacts with political organization, economic structure, and belief systems. Societies with decentralized systems may absorb stress longer. Highly centralized states can unravel quickly once surplus fails. Archaeology shows that collapse usually follows prolonged strain rather than a single catastrophe. Across time, the sequence repeats. Climate shifts quietly, crops fail intermittently, storage systems compensate until they cannot, authority weakens, people disperse. Later generations inherit ruins and fragmented stories. The climate event itself leaves no inscription. What remains is a break in continuity that later societies struggle to explain. When resources thin before people notice. Every civilization depends on a balance between what it takes and what the land can replace. This balance is rarely measured directly. It is felt through yield, distance, effort, and time. When resources are plentiful, expansion feels natural. Fields widen, forests retreat, mines deepen, trade routes lengthen. Scarcity arrives slowly, often hidden behind systems that delay its impact. Resource depletion does not announce itself as collapse. It appears first as adjustment. Wood must be gathered farther from the settlement. Soil requires longer fallow periods. Metal becomes harder to acquire. These changes are absorbed quietly by labor and organization. Only later do they begin to alter political and social structures. In ancient Mesopotamia, early city-states depended heavily on irrigation agriculture. Canals brought water from the Tigris and Euphrates across dry plains. Over time, this system increased agricultural output, supporting dense populations and specialized labor. Yet, irrigation carried a long-term cost. As water evaporated in the heat, salts accumulated in the soil. Archaeological studies of crop remains show a gradual shift from wheat to barley, a more salt-tolerant grain, beginning around 3000 BCE. Yields still declined. Administrative tablets from the period record grain rations and labor assignments, but do not mention soil exhaustion. The system continued to function on paper, while productivity weakened beneath it. When climate stress later reduced water availability, already degraded land could not recover. The agricultural base narrowed. Cities that depended on surplus became fragile. A similar pattern appears in the Eastern Mediterranean. Bronze Age economies relied on complex trade networks to supply tin, copper, timber, and grain. Many regions lacked one or more of these essentials. Cyprus provided copper, Anatolia supplied timber. Tin travelled long distances from Central Asia or Europe. This interdependence allowed rapid growth but created vulnerability. When trade routes were disrupted around 1200 BCE, metal production declined sharply. Weapons and tools became scarce. Archaeological layers show a drop in bronze artifacts and a return to simpler technologies. Resource depletion also affects energy sources. For early societies, energy came primarily from wood, animals, and human labor. Deforestation appears repeatedly in the archaeological record. In ancient Greece, Plato noted that hills once forested had become bare rock by his time. He described soil washing into the sea, leaving the land thin and dry. While philosophical in tone, his observation aligns with modern soil erosion studies in the region. On Easter Island, pollen records show a steady decline in tree species over centuries. Trees were used for canoes, construction, and possibly for transporting stone statues. As forests disappeared, soil erosion increased, crop yields fell, fishing became harder without large boats. The society did not collapse in a single moment. It adjusted repeatedly until options narrowed. By the time Europeans arrived in the 18th century, the island's population and material culture had diminished significantly. Mining leaves similar traces. In Roman Spain, large-scale silver and gold mining reshaped landscapes. Water-powered mining techniques required extensive timber for construction and fuel. Over time, accessible ore deposits were exhausted. Mines became deeper and more dangerous. Returns diminished. While Rome had access to vast territories, local depletion still mattered. Provinces that could no longer supply resources lost strategic value. Urban centres magnify depletion because they concentrate consumption. Cities rely on hinterlands for food, fuel, and materials. As populations grow, the distance between city and resource increases. Transport costs rise. Roads and ships compensate until they cannot. Archaeological surveys around ancient cities often show expanding zones of extraction over time. When these zones reach their limits, cities must contract or reorganize. In the Indus Valley, standardized bricks required large amounts of fuel for firing. As urban centers expanded, demand for wood increased. Combined with shifting river systems, this placed pressure on local environments. Later settlements used sun-dried bricks instead. This change reduced fuel use, but also reduced building durability. Architecture became simpler, reflecting altered resource constraints. Water itself can be depleted. Aquifers recharge slowly. Springs dry when overused. In Petra, the Nabatean city carved into rock, elaborate water management systems captured rainfall and channeled it into cisterns. This allowed the city to flourish in a desert environment. When trade routes shifted and maintenance declined, the system faltered. Without constant upkeep, water infrastructure loses effectiveness. The city's population declined gradually. Resource depletion often interacts with social inequality. Elites typically control access to remaining resources. Archaeological evidence from late Maya sites shows increasing disparity in housing and burial goods during periods of environmental stress. Common households shrink while elite compounds persist longer. This imbalance can destabilize political systems by reducing collective resilience. In China, dynastic records frequently mention shortages of salt, iron, or grain. State monopolies controlled key resources. When supply failed, unrest followed. During the late Han Dynasty, land concentration reduced the number of small farmers. Large estates absorbed resources, while tax bases shrank. Soil exhaustion compounded the problem. Peasant rebellions emerged during periods of declining productivity, not sudden disaster. One difficulty in identifying depletion is that it leaves no single destruction layer. Forests thin gradually. Soil washes away slowly. Ore veins empty incrementally. These processes are visible only when long-term data is assembled. Ancient societies experienced the effects without recognizing the pattern. Technological innovation can delay depletion. New tools allow deeper mining, broader farming, or more efficient transport. Yet innovation often accelerates extraction. What is gained in efficiency is lost in scale. The underlying resource still declines. Archaeology shows repeated cycles of intensification followed by simplification. Unlike climate shifts, which originate outside human control, resource depletion is driven by human behavior. It emerges from success rather than failure. Systems that work well encourage expansion. Limits appear only after thresholds are crossed. By then, reversal is difficult. Adaptation to depletion requires restraint, redistribution, or relocation. These responses challenge existing power structures. Historical records suggest that such changes are rare. More often, societies maintain existing systems until they fail. The pattern appears across regions and eras. Resources thin, work increases, returns diminish, social systems strain, populations move or reorganize. Later cultures inherit landscapes shaped by extraction but lack memory of how abundance once appeared. The archaeological record does not show civilizations ending because resources vanish completely. Instead, it shows systems becoming too inefficient to support complexity. Cities shrink, writing declines, craft specialization narrows. What remains is simpler, more flexible, and less demanding of the land. When trade breaks, distance becomes a barrier again. Trade allows civilizations to stretch beyond local limits. It moves food where it cannot grow, metals where they cannot be mined, and ideas where they were never formed. Roads, rivers, and sea lanes bind distant regions into a single system. As long as movement remains reliable, scarcity in one place can be offset by surplus in another. When trade weakens, distance regains its weight. Early trade networks were not informal exchanges. They were structured systems tied to political authority, seasonal schedules, and shared expectations. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE record deliveries of timber from Lebanon, copper from Oman, and stone from Iran. These materials did not move on chance. They travelled along routes, protected by agreements, tribute, and force. When any part of the route failed, the flow slowed or stopped. Trade networks create dependency. Regions specialize. One area produces grain, another metal, another textiles. Specialization increases efficiency, but it reduces independence. Archaeological layers show that once specialization deepens, local substitutes disappear. When trade breaks, societies cannot easily return to older self-sufficient models. The Late Bronze Age provides a clear example. Between roughly 1600 and 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was connected by dense trade routes. Shipwrecks, such as the Uluburun wreck off the coast of Turkey, carried copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, and luxury goods from multiple regions. Palaces in Mycenae, Ugarit, and Hattusa relied on these networks to supply raw materials and prestige items. Around 1200 BCE, these connections unravelled. Written correspondence from Ugarit records urgent requests for grain and military assistance. The letters stop abruptly. Archaeological evidence shows that ports were abandoned, cities burned, and trade goods vanished from circulation. Without tin, bronze production collapsed. Iron tools appeared later, but the transition took generations. The cause was not a single failure. Climate stress reduced surplus, piracy increased, political instability weakened route protection. Each disruption reinforced the others. Once trade volumes fell below a critical threshold, maintaining ships, roads, and storage facilities became unprofitable. Distance expanded again. Regions that had relied on imports were forced to simplify. Trade collapse does not affect all areas equally. Coastal cities often fail first because they depend most on external supply. Inland communities with diversified subsistence can persist longer. Archaeological surveys show that after the Bronze Age collapse, settlement patterns shifted toward defensible, resource-local locations. Long-distance exchange became rare. In the Roman world, trade reached an unprecedented scale. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Olive oil from Hispania reached Britain. Pottery styles spread across thousands of kilometers. This system depended on roads, ports, standardized currency, and political stability. When imperial authority weakened in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, trade contracted. Archaeological evidence from Britain shows a sharp decline in imported goods after Roman withdrawal around 410 CE. Coins disappear from circulation, pottery production becomes local and less standardized. Roof tiles vanish. Buildings revert to wood. The population did not disappear. The system that supported complexity did. Trade also carries information. Writing systems, measurement standards, and technical knowledge move along routes. When trade declines, knowledge fragments. The loss of Roman concrete technology illustrates this pattern. The formula existed, but without widespread construction and training, it was not transmitted effectively. Skills narrowed to local needs. In the Andes, the Inca road system linked diverse ecological zones. Goods moved vertically rather than horizontally, from coast to highlands to jungle. This network allowed redistribution during shortages. After Spanish disruption, the system collapsed. Roads fell into disuse. Communities became isolated. The empire's administrative knowledge vanished within a generation. Trade networks require maintenance. Roads erode. Ships rot. Ports silt up. These systems demand constant investment. When returns diminish, maintenance stops. The decline accelerates. Archaeology shows that abandoned infrastructure often decays rapidly once upkeep ends. One feature of trade collapse is invisibility at first. Goods still circulate, but with delay. Prices rise, substitutes appear. Only later does absence become noticeable. In texts from the late Roman Empire, writers complain of corruption, inflation, and moral decay. They rarely mention the breakdown of logistics. Yet supply systems were already failing. Trade failure also reshapes power. Elites who control remaining routes gain leverage. Peripheral regions lose influence. Political fragmentation increases. Archaeological evidence from post-collapse societies shows smaller political units replacing large states. Authority becomes local because long-distance coordination is no longer viable. In some cases, trade resumes in altered form. After the early medieval period, new trade networks emerged in Europe based on rivers and regional fairs rather than imperial roads. These systems supported different social structures. The reset was not temporary, it produced a new equilibrium. Trade collapse often coincides with changes in material culture. Artifact diversity declines. Craft specialization reduces. Items once common become rare or ceremonial. This narrowing reflects reduced access to raw materials and markets. Simpler goods dominate because they can be produced locally. Unlike natural disasters, trade collapse leaves few dramatic ruins. Warehouses empty, ports quiet, roads narrow into paths. The absence of movement defines the change. Archaeologists identify it through distribution patterns rather than destruction layers. Distance itself becomes a barrier again. What once took weeks now takes months or becomes impossible. Ideas slow, innovation localizes. Societies turn inward, not by choice but by necessity. Across civilizations, the pattern repeats. Trade expands during stability. Specialization deepens. Dependency grows. When pressure mounts, roots falter. Once movement drops below a threshold, recovery becomes unlikely. Systems reset around shorter distances and smaller scales. The archaeological record shows that complexity depends on connection. When connections fail, civilizations do not vanish. They contract, they simplify, they rebuild with what remains within reach. When control tightens and flexibility disappears, centralized power allows civilizations to coordinate large systems. It organizes labor, collects surplus, enforces law, and directs resources across wide territories. Roads are built. Armies are supplied. Cities are planned according to shared rules. When conditions are stable, centralization increases efficiency. When conditions change, the same structure can become a liability. Early states formed around control of key resources. In Egypt, authority centered on regulation of the Nile flood. In Mesopotamia, rulers managed irrigation networks and grain storage. In China, dynasties oversaw land distribution, taxation, and river control. These systems worked because local variation could be absorbed by central redistribution. Surplus from one region compensated for shortage in another. Centralization depends on reliable information flow. Officials must know how much grain exists, where labor is available, and which areas are under stress. As territories expand, information moves more slowly. Reports become delayed, filtered, or distorted. Archaeological records show increasing layers of administration in late-stage states. Clay tablets multiply. Bureaucratic seals diversify. Complexity rises before collapse, not after. In the Akkadian Empire, centralized authority extended across diverse ecological zones. Governors were appointed to distant cities. Tribute flowed toward the capital. When drought reduced agricultural output, local officials still faced fixed quotas. Failure to deliver grain became rebellion or neglect in the records. Central rules did not adapt quickly to local conditions. Pressure accumulated at the edges. Egypt's Old Kingdom shows a similar pattern. Pyramid construction required massive coordination of labor and resources. Central authority directed quarrying, transport, and food distribution. When Nile floods weakened, the system struggled to support both monumental projects and local needs. Power shifted toward regional governors who could respond directly to shortages. The central state lost relevance before it lost legitimacy. In the Maya world, political power was fragmented among city-states, yet authority within each center was highly centralized. Kings controlled ritual calendars, warfare, and redistribution. As drought cycles intensified, rulers maintained monument building and court life, while agricultural yields declined. Inscriptions show continued emphasis on dynastic continuity, even as populations dispersed. The political structure remained rigid, while the social base eroded. Centralized systems often suppress local autonomy. This increases uniformity, but reduces adaptive capacity. Local communities may know how to adjust farming practices or settlement patterns, but centralized directives limit experimentation. Archaeological evidence from late Roman provinces shows standardized tax demands despite regional variation in productivity. Compliance weakened as conditions diverged from expectations. The Roman Empire relied on centralized taxation and supply systems to feed cities and armies. Grain shipments followed fixed routes, coinage standardized exchange. When frontier pressures increased and revenues declined, the state responded by tightening control. Taxes rose, professions became hereditary, mobility decreased. These measures preserved order temporarily but reduced flexibility. Local economies contracted under rigid demands. Central authority also concentrates risk. When decision-making rests with a small elite, errors propagate widely. In decentralized systems, failure remains local. In centralized systems, misjudgment affects entire regions. Archaeological layers from collapsed states often show synchronized decline across vast areas, suggesting system-wide failure rather than isolated events. In China, dynastic cycles illustrate the limits of centralized power. The Qin dynasty unified weights, measures, writing, and law. These reforms increased efficiency but demanded strict compliance. When labor demands and taxes exceeded tolerance, rebellion followed quickly. The dynasty collapsed within 15 years. Later dynasties balanced central control with local administration, yet the tension persisted. Centralization also shapes belief systems. Authority is often justified through ideology, divine mandate, or law. When conditions worsen, these narratives lose credibility. Texts from the Late Bronze Age show increasing emphasis on ritual correctness and divine appeasement during periods of stress. Rather than reforming systems, rulers reinforced ideology. As central systems weaken, informal networks emerge. Archaeological evidence shows increased household production, local trade, and community storage during late phases of states. These adaptations indicate resilience at small scales. However, they also signal withdrawal from centralized structures. Once participation declines, the state loses capacity to recover. One feature of centralized collapse is administrative silence. Records cease abruptly. Writing systems disappear or simplify. This does not imply population loss alone. It reflects the collapse of record-keeping institutions. Without centralized administration, writing loses immediate purpose. Knowledge persists orally or locally, but is no longer standardized. Infrastructure suffers as well. Roads, canals, and public buildings require coordinated maintenance. When central authority falters, upkeep stops. Archaeological surveys show canals filling with sediment and roads narrowing into paths. These changes occur gradually, but become irreversible once neglected. Centralization delays visible collapse because it redistributes stress. Surplus can mask local failure. When redistribution fails, decline appears sudden. This illusion has shaped historical narratives. Collapse seems abrupt in texts, but prolonged in material evidence. The pattern repeats across civilizations. Power concentrates to manage growth. Systems expand. Adaptability decreases. When pressure mounts, centralized responses lag behind changing conditions. Local solutions are constrained. Failure spreads rapidly once thresholds are crossed. Civilizations do not collapse because they centralize. They collapse because centralized systems resist change. Flexibility is traded for control. When stability ends, control becomes rigidity. The archaeological record shows that after collapse, societies reorganize around smaller units. Authority becomes local. Production diversifies. Complexity reduces. These changes are not regressions. They are adjustments to limits imposed by environment, resources, and coordination capacity. Central power fades before populations disappear. What ends is the ability to act as one system across distance. What remains is human presence adapting to narrower scales. When belief freezes systems in place, belief systems give civilizations coherence. They explain why authority exists, why rules must be followed, and why suffering has meaning. Belief binds people who will never meet into a shared understanding of the world. In stable periods, belief strengthens coordination. In periods of strain, the same belief can prevent adaptation. Belief is not limited to religion. It includes political legitimacy, social hierarchy, cosmology, and assumptions about how the world is supposed to work. These frameworks guide decisions long before evidence is weighed. When conditions change, belief systems often change last. In early states, rulers commonly justified authority through divine sanction. Egyptian pharaohs were embodiments of cosmic order. Mesopotamian kings ruled by mandate of the gods. Chinese emperors governed under the mandate of heaven. These systems linked environmental stability to moral order. When floods failed or droughts persisted, the explanation was not structural weakness, but ritual failure. This framing shaped responses. Instead of revising irrigation methods or land use, leaders increased offerings, ceremonies, and monument construction. Archaeological layers from late Old Kingdom Egypt show continued investment in tombs and temples, even as central authority weakened. Ritual activity intensified, while administrative capacity declined. Texts from Mesopotamia reflect similar patterns. During periods of famine, rulers commissioned hymns and lamentations. The lament for Ur describes the city's fall as divinely ordained. The narrative focuses on cosmic sorrow rather than environmental stress. This language preserved meaning but obscured cause. Belief systems often encode success. They evolve during periods when strategies work. Over time, these strategies harden into doctrine. What once described reality becomes a rule that reality must obey. When evidence contradicts belief, the system resists revision. In the Maya world, kingship was tied to calendar cycles, ritual bloodletting, and astronomical order. Monument inscriptions emphasized continuity of time and lineage. As droughts intensified, rulers continued to erect stelae marking ritual dates. The inscriptions remain precise until they stop entirely. There is little indication of ideological change before political collapse. In the Roman Empire, belief took institutional form. Roman law, citizenship, and imperial ideology emphasized permanence. The empire presented itself as eternal. When trade declined and revenues fell, reforms focused on preserving existing structures. Professions were made hereditary, taxes were fixed. These measures reflected belief in order through continuity. Flexibility was limited because change itself was seen as destabilizing. Christianity later provided a different explanatory framework. During late antiquity, suffering was interpreted as moral trial rather than administrative failure. This belief helped communities endure contraction but did not preserve imperial systems. The meaning of decline shifted, but material complexity still reduced. In China, belief in the mandate of heaven allowed dynastic change while preserving the structure of authority. Natural disasters were signs that the mandate had been lost. Rebellion became justified. This belief provided a release valve. Yet within each dynasty, belief delayed reform. Officials often focused on restoring ritual correctness rather than addressing structural inequality or land exhaustion. Belief also shapes perception of risk. If a society believes its system is favored by gods or history, warnings are discounted. Archaeological evidence from late-stage states often shows continued expansion or monumental building despite declining returns. The belief in inevitability masks fragility. Ideology influences resource use. Sacred groves, ritual calendars, and taboo systems can protect environments. They can also enforce unsustainable practices. On Easter Island, statues likely held religious significance tied to social status and ancestral power. Even as resources declined, statue construction continued for centuries. The belief system sustained effort beyond ecological limits. Belief affects information flow. Uncomfortable data is suppressed or reinterpreted. In centralized states, officials report success to avoid punishment. Archaeological records show discrepancies between administrative texts and material evidence. Grain quotas remain unchanged even as storage facilities shrink. The belief in stability outpaces reality. Writing systems themselves reinforce belief. Once records standardize expectations, deviation becomes error rather than signal. The absence of language to describe systemic failure limits response. Ancient societies lacked concepts such as ecological overshoot or systemic risk. Their belief frameworks did not include these ideas. Belief systems also shape memory. After collapse, survivors reinterpret the past. Myths of golden ages and divine punishment emerge. These narratives preserve identity but distort causation. Archaeology often contradicts later stories. Prosperity was uneven, decline was gradual. Belief compresses complexity into moral lessons. In medieval Europe, belief in divine order structured society. Famine and plague were interpreted as punishment or testing. While this belief provided meaning, it delayed public health responses. Cities continued rituals rather than altering sanitation. Only after repeated failure did practices change. Belief does not prevent adaptation entirely. It filters which adaptations are acceptable. Changes that align with belief are adopted. Those that challenge it are resisted. This selective adaptation can be enough for survival, but not for maintaining complexity. Collapse often follows a period of intensified belief. Ritual increases, orthodoxy hardens, dissent is suppressed. Archaeological layers show increased standardization of symbols and practices just before systems fragment. Diversity declines before material collapse becomes visible. When belief systems fail, they fail suddenly. Authority loses legitimacy. Symbols lose power. Writing ceases. The social glue dissolves. What remains are local practices, untethered from overarching meaning. After collapse, new belief systems emerge. They often incorporate fragments of the old. Ruins become sacred. Past builders become gods or giants. The loss of understanding is absorbed into myth. The archaeological record suggests that belief is both stabilizer and trap. It enables coordination across distance and time. It also locks systems into paths that become maladaptive. Change threatens meaning before it threatens survival. Civilizations rarely abandon belief voluntarily. Belief erodes only when material conditions force contradiction too large to ignore. By then, recovery at the same scale is unlikely. The pattern repeats. Belief forms around success. Success enables expansion. Expansion introduces strain. Belief resists revision. Strain accumulates. Collapse reframes belief rather than resolving cause. What survives collapse is not ideology, but habit. People continue daily practices. They farm, trade locally, tell stories. Large explanations fade. Smaller ones persist. Belief does not end civilizations. It delays recognition of limits. When limits assert themselves, belief reshapes memory, not structure. When population grows past what systems can carry. Population growth is often treated as a sign of success. More people imply stability, security, and productive land. For early civilizations, increasing population meant more labor for fields, armies, and construction. Cities expanded, settlements multiplied, authority deepened. Yet population is not neutral. It places constant pressure on every supporting system. When growth outpaces capacity, strain accumulates quietly. In small communities, population adjusts through migration, delayed reproduction, or shifting subsistence. In complex civilizations, population becomes harder to regulate. Infrastructure locks people into place. Food systems depend on scale. Once growth becomes structural, reduction is no longer voluntary. Archaeological evidence shows that many civilizations reached their peak population shortly before contraction. This pattern appears repeatedly. Growth continues even as productivity plateaus. Surplus narrows. Margins disappear. Systems become brittle under their own weight. In ancient Mesopotamia, early irrigation allowed high population density in otherwise arid land. Cities expanded rapidly during the 3rd millennium BCE. Census-style tablets record labor assignments and rations for thousands of workers. Yet irrigation systems required constant maintenance. As population increased, canals lengthened and became harder to manage. Labor demands rose. When yields declined due to soil salinity and climate stress, the population could not be supported at previous levels. Population pressure often intensifies inequality. As land becomes scarce, elites consolidate holdings. Small farmers lose access. Archaeological surveys from late Roman North Africa show large estates expanding while small rural settlements disappear. Population did not vanish immediately. It became concentrated and dependent. In Egypt, population growth during stable Nile cycles supported large-scale construction and bureaucracy. When floods weakened, food shortages appeared first in marginal regions. Texts from the First Intermediate Period describe people leaving villages in search of grain. Population movement increased. Urban centres shrank unevenly. The total population declined gradually, not catastrophically. The Maya lowlands show similar dynamics. During the Classic period, population density reached high levels in regions with thin soils. Terracing, reservoirs, and raised fields extended carrying capacity. These adaptations worked under normal rainfall. When drought cycles intensified, the margin vanished. Archaeological evidence shows abandoned house platforms and reduced residential density before the collapse of elite centres. Population pressure also affects forests, soil, and water. More people require more fuel, more fields, more grazing. Over time, environmental degradation feeds back into demographic stress. This loop is visible on Easter Island, where population growth coincided with deforestation. As trees disappeared, food production declined. The population contracted after the ecological threshold was crossed. Demographic stress is rarely visible in monumental architecture. Temples and palaces can persist while living conditions worsen. Archaeologists identify pressure through smaller indicators. Decreased average house size, reduced dietary diversity, increased skeletal markers of stress such as enamel hypoplasia and shortened stature. Population growth also strains governance. More people require more administration. Records increase. Tax systems expand. When population becomes dense, disputes rise. Law enforcement and conflict resolution require greater coordination. Centralized systems respond by increasing control. This response preserves order temporarily, but reduces adaptability. Migration is a common response to population pressure. Archaeological layers often show new settlements appearing at the edges of cultivated zones. These frontier communities relieve pressure briefly. Over time, they face the same constraints. Migration delays collapse, but does not prevent it when growth continues. In the late Roman Empire, population pressure interacted with declining productivity. As revenues fell, taxes increased. Rural populations fled land to escape obligations. Laws attempted to bind people to professions and locations. These measures reduced mobility, locking population into failing systems. Archaeological evidence shows abandoned farms and shrinking towns, not mass death. Population dynamics also influence military systems. Large populations can support standing armies. When food supply weakens, armies become burdens. States respond by increasing requisition, which further strains civilians. Texts from late imperial China record conscription crises during famine years. Military demands intensified unrest rather than stabilizing it. Disease often follows population density. Crowded conditions facilitate transmission. Malnutrition weakens immunity. Skeletal evidence from late-stage civilizations shows increased signs of infection and stress. While disease may accelerate decline, it rarely initiates it. Population pressure creates vulnerability. One difficulty in identifying demographic collapse is that numbers rarely vanish. People remain, but distribution changes. Urban populations shrink, while rural areas fragment. Writing and administration decline because density no longer supports specialization. Population becomes dispersed rather than extinct. Belief systems often interpret population decline as moral failure or divine judgment. Historical texts rarely frame it as systemic overload. Archaeology provides a different picture. Population peaks coincide with maximum exploitation of land and resources. Decline follows when systems cannot expand further. Technological innovation can raise carrying capacity temporarily. New crops, tools, or methods allow more people to be supported. This success encourages further growth. Eventually, limits are reached again. The cycle repeats at a higher scale. In the Indus Valley, population redistributed rather than collapsing outright. Urban density declined while rural settlements increased. The society adjusted demographically. Complexity reduced, but continuity remained. Writing disappeared because the administrative density required to maintain it no longer existed. Population pressure also alters social relations. Competition increases. Trust erodes. Archaeological evidence from late phases of many civilizations shows increased fortification and violence. These are not always signs of invasion. They often reflect internal stress. One pattern appears repeatedly. Population growth continues until decline becomes unavoidable. By the time contraction begins, systems designed for expansion cannot reverse. Reduction occurs through migration, lowered birth rates, disease, and social fragmentation. The archaeological record suggests that population collapse is rarely sudden. It unfolds unevenly across regions and classes. Elites persist longer. Marginal groups move first. Cities empty gradually. The appearance of abandonment masks long-term stress. Civilizations do not fall because population grows. They falter because growth outpaces flexibility. Once systems require constant expansion to remain stable, any disruption becomes dangerous. After collapse, population often stabilizes at lower density. Land recovers. Resources regenerate. New societies emerge with different limits. The memory of overextension fades. Population pressure leaves no single ruin. It leaves absence, empty houses, reclaimed fields, roads that lead nowhere. These traces mark the point where systems exceeded what land and organization could sustain, when knowledge thins and skills stop crossing generations. Civilizations depend not only on resources, population, or power, but on continuity of knowledge. Skills must be taught, techniques must be practiced. Systems must be understood well enough to be repaired. When knowledge transmission weakens, complexity becomes difficult to sustain, even if people and materials remain. Knowledge does not exist evenly across society. It is concentrated in specialists, engineers, scribes, builders, metalworkers, navigators, physicians. These roles require long training. They depend on institutions that support learning, repetition, and correction. When those institutions falter, knowledge narrows quickly. Archaeology shows that loss of knowledge often follows collapse rather than causing it directly. Yet once knowledge is lost, rebuilding at the same level becomes unlikely. Civilizations restart, but they restart simpler. Writing is one of the clearest markers. It appears, disappears, and reappears repeatedly in human history. In Mycenaean Greece, Linear B was used to record palace administration. When palace centers collapsed around 1200 BCE, writing vanished entirely from the region. For nearly 4 centuries, Greece left no written records. Population continued, farming continued, but administration, record-keeping, and long-distance coordination did not. When writing returned in the 8th century BCE, it was not a continuation of Linear B. It was a new system adapted from Phoenician scripts. The old knowledge had not been preserved, it had been replaced. The same pattern appears in the Indus Valley. Thousands of seals carry short inscriptions dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. After urban centers declined, writing disappeared completely. No later culture in the region preserved or reused the script. Even today, it remains undeciphered because continuity was broken. Knowledge loss also affects construction. Roman concrete allowed durable buildings, aqueducts, and harbours. The technique required precise mixtures of lime, volcanic ash, and aggregate. After the decline of Roman administration, large-scale concrete construction ceased in Western Europe. Medieval builders reused Roman structures but did not reproduce the material at scale. The knowledge existed somewhere, but not in a form that could be transmitted reliably. This loss was not immediate. Late Roman buildings still used advanced techniques over generations. As training systems collapsed and demand declined, skills narrowed. Builders focused on what was locally feasible. Wood replaced stone. Mortar quality declined. Architecture simplified. Navigation provides another example. Ancient Polynesians navigated vast distances using stars, waves, and birds. This knowledge was oral and experiential. It required constant practice. When populations declined or routes ceased to be used, navigation skills degraded. Some islands became isolated not because seas changed, but because knowledge pathways broke. In the Roman world, road maintenance depended on skilled surveyors and engineers. When imperial funding ended, roads deteriorated. Without training systems to replace retiring specialists, the ability to maintain infrastructure vanished. Roads became paths, paths became local tracks. Knowledge transmission depends on density. Specialists require audiences, apprentices, and repetition. When populations disperse, specialization becomes inefficient. A single village cannot support a full-time metallurgist or scribe. Skills become generalized, precision declines. Archaeological evidence often shows this shift. Toolkits simplify, artifact diversity decreases, standardization weakens. These changes reflect loss of shared technique rather than lack of intelligence. People adapt to narrower conditions. Education systems are particularly fragile. Schools, workshops, and apprenticeships require stability. They depend on surplus to support learners who do not produce immediately. When surplus declines, training shortens. Skills are passed down imperfectly or not at all. In late-stage civilizations, elites often preserve symbolic knowledge while practical knowledge erodes. Ritual texts survive longer than engineering manuals. Monumental inscriptions continue after water systems fail. Belief is recorded while technique fades. This imbalance appears in Egypt. Religious texts were copied for centuries, while practical construction methods changed. Later builders imitated forms without understanding proportions. Temples persisted. Engineering quality declined. Knowledge loss also affects medicine. Skeletal evidence from post-collapse societies shows increased untreated injuries and chronic conditions. This does not mean healing knowledge vanished entirely, but complex procedures and specialized care became rare. One reason knowledge thins is that it is cumulative. Techniques rely on previous techniques. When one layer disappears, higher layers collapse. You cannot maintain aqueducts without survey skills. You cannot survey without measurement standards. You cannot maintain standards without centralized authority or shared practice. Writing itself requires maintenance. Scripts evolve. If literacy declines below a threshold, errors accumulate. Over time, texts become unreadable. This happened with Egyptian hieroglyphs after the Roman period. The script survived as decoration long after its meaning was lost. Only in the 19th century was it deciphered again. Knowledge loss is often invisible to contemporaries. Each generation adapts to what it knows. Decline is felt as normal. People do not notice what no longer exists. Only later comparisons reveal the gap. This creates the illusion of mystery. Later, societies encounter ruins they cannot explain. Stonework appears impossible. Techniques seem beyond human ability. Myths emerge to fill the gap. Giants, gods, lost races. The loss of knowledge is reframed as the presence of the supernatural. Archaeology consistently shows that lost knowledge was once ordinary. Stone cutting, alignment, metallurgy, and surveying were practiced by trained humans using methods appropriate to their time. When training systems collapsed, methods vanished. Knowledge transmission also depends on peace. War disrupts apprenticeship. Craftsmen are killed or displaced. Libraries burn. Oral traditions break when elders die without students. Repeated conflict accelerates loss. Trade networks once carried knowledge alongside goods. When trade collapses, ideas localize. Innovations do not spread. Techniques diverge. Over time, shared standards disappear. What was once common becomes regional. The loss of knowledge does not mean a loss of creativity. Post-collapse societies innovate within constraints. New methods appear, but they are not direct continuations. They are fresh starts shaped by available skills. This restart explains why civilizations do not simply resume where they left off. Even if resources return, knowledge gaps prevent immediate recovery. Systems must be rebuilt from simpler foundations. The archaeological record shows repeated stair-step patterns. Complexity rises, then drops. It rises again, but differently. Writing returns in new forms. Architecture resumes with altered methods. Governance reappears at smaller scales. Knowledge loss also affects time perception. Without records, history compresses, generations blur. Events are remembered as myths rather than sequences. This alters decision-making. Long-term planning becomes difficult without reference. Civilizations do not collapse because people forget. They collapse because systems that transmit memory fail. When memory narrows, society becomes present-focused. Survival replaces continuity. After collapse, knowledge persists unevenly. Some skills survive in pockets. Others vanish entirely. This uneven survival shapes the next civilization's character. The pattern is consistent. Systems thin, specialists disappear, knowledge fragments. Reconstruction begins with what remains close at hand. Civilizations restart, not because people are less capable, but because inherited understanding has been reduced. What follows is not regression, but reorientation, when fear reshapes how societies organize. Repeated instability leaves marks that are not always visible in ruins or records. It changes how people plan, build, and trust. When collapse is preceded by violence, famine, or displacement, societies that follow do not simply rebuild old systems. They reorganize around caution. Security replaces expansion. Defense replaces ambition. Horizons shrink. Archaeology shows that periods after major disruption are often defined less by loss of ability than by altered priorities. People remember danger even when conditions improve. This memory shapes settlement patterns, architecture, and social structure for generations. One of the clearest indicators is fortification. After the late Bronze Age collapse, many communities across the eastern Mediterranean relocated to hilltops or defensible locations. Mycenaean palaces vanished, but small fortified villages appeared. Walls became thicker, entrances narrowed, storage moved inward. These changes reflect fear of renewed disruption rather than immediate threat. In earlier periods, large cities relied on openness. Trade required access. Agriculture required movement. After trauma, openness became risk. Settlements clustered tightly. Space was organized to be controlled rather than optimized. Archaeological surveys show fewer roads, shorter trade routes, and more localized exchange. Fear alters time horizons. Long-term projects decline. Monumental construction slows or stops. Infrastructure that requires decades of maintenance becomes unattractive. Instead, people invest in structures that provide immediate protection or utility. Houses become sturdier but simpler. Public buildings shrink. The future becomes uncertain, so investment shortens. In the Near East, following repeated invasions and collapses, urban life gave way to village-based organization. Writing persisted only where administration was essential. Most communities relied on oral memory and customary law. This was not ignorance, it was efficiency under risk. Repeated trauma also reshapes social trust. Large systems require cooperation among strangers. After collapse, trust narrows to kin, clan, or local group. Archaeological evidence shows increased household self-sufficiency. Storage pits appear inside homes rather than communal granaries. Craft production decentralizes. This reduces vulnerability but limits scale. In the Roman world, the late Empire and post-imperial period show this shift clearly. Villas fortified themselves. Town walls were repaired even as civic buildings decayed. Coin circulation declined. Barter increased. Local patrons replaced distant authorities. People relied on protection rather than law. Fear also influences movement. Migration becomes cautious. Groups move shorter distances. Borders harden. Archaeological patterns show reduced long-distance colonization after major collapses. Even when land is available, risk discourages expansion. In China, periods following dynastic collapse often show fragmentation into smaller, defensible units. Walled towns multiplied, military households expanded. Agricultural communities focused on subsistence rather than surplus. State ideology shifted toward order and discipline, reflecting collective memory of chaos. Violence leaves demographic scars. Archaeological sites from collapse periods often show signs of trauma in skeletal remains. Weapon injuries increase. Defensive architecture becomes common. Even after violence subsides, its memory persists in planning choices. Fear reshapes governance. Large, centralized authority becomes suspect. Local leaders gain prominence because they are visible and accountable. This does not eliminate hierarchy, but it shortens chains of command. Archaeology shows more regional variation in material culture after collapse, reflecting local autonomy. Economic behavior changes as well. Risk discourages specialization. Households diversify production to reduce dependence. This leads to lower efficiency but higher resilience. Craft goods become less refined but more accessible. Archaeologists often misinterpret this as decline rather than adaptation. Religion and belief systems absorb fear. Protective rituals increase. Amulets, boundary markers, and apotropaic symbols become common. These practices reflect psychological need rather than superstition. They are attempts to impose control where systems failed. In medieval Europe, following the collapse of Roman authority, churches became places of refuge as much as worship. Sacred space doubled as protection. Law blended with custom. Written codes simplified. Fear shaped moral frameworks toward obedience and stability. One consequence of fear is reduced innovation. Innovation involves risk. In insecure environments, deviation is costly. Archaeological evidence shows slower technological change after collapse. Techniques stabilize rather than advance. This conservatism preserves survival but delays recovery of complexity. Fear also alters memory. Traumatic events are preserved in story and myth. Invasion narratives, flood legends, and moral warnings proliferate. These stories encode caution. They discourage behaviors associated with past disaster, even if conditions have changed. Settlement spacing provides another clue. After repeated trauma, communities space themselves closer together for mutual defense or farther apart to reduce competition. Both patterns appear in the archaeological record depending on environment and threat type. The cumulative effect is contraction of scale. Societies become inward-focused. Trade networks shorten. Political units shrink. Authority becomes personal rather than institutional. These systems are not failures. They are stable under constraint. Recovery from fear is slow. Even when conditions improve, behavioral patterns persist. Defensive walls remain. Trade resumes cautiously. Trust rebuilds over generations, not decades. This inertia explains why civilizations do not rebound quickly after collapse. Archaeology shows that some societies never attempt to restore previous scale. They stabilize at lower complexity and persist for centuries. This is not stagnation, it is equilibrium shaped by memory. Fear does not destroy civilizations, it transforms them. It replaces expansion with endurance. It reshapes values towards safety and predictability. These changes make future collapse less likely, but also limit growth. The pattern is consistent. Trauma precedes contraction. Contraction reshapes behavior. Behavior defines the next civilization's form. What later historians call decline often represents a conscious shift towards survival under uncertainty. The loss is not capacity, but ambition. Civilizations restart smaller not because they cannot rebuild, but because they choose caution over risk after remembering what collapse felt like. When pressures align and recovery becomes impossible, civilizations rarely collapse from a single cause. Archaeology does not show societies ending because of one drought, one war, or one bad ruler. Instead, it reveals layers of stress accumulating over time. Each pressure weakens a different part of the system. When these pressures begin to align, recovery narrows. At a certain point, no single reform can reverse the direction. This stage is difficult to recognize from within. Individual problems appear manageable. Grain shortages can be addressed with redistribution. Trade disruption can be offset by storage. Political unrest can be suppressed. Belief systems can reinterpret failure. As long as stresses remain separate, systems adapt. Collapse emerges when adaptation in one area worsens conditions in another. Climate stress often sets the background. Reduced rainfall lowers yields. This forces expansion into marginal land or intensification of existing fields. Resource depletion follows. Soil thins. Forests retreat. Productivity declines further. To compensate, trade networks expand. Dependency increases. Central authority tightens control to manage scarcity. Each response solves a short-term problem while amplifying long-term risk. Archaeological sequences show this convergence repeatedly. In the late Bronze Age, Eastern Mediterranean, drought reduced agricultural surplus. This weakened palace economies that relied on redistribution. As surplus declined, trade became more critical. When piracy and conflict disrupted trade routes, metal supply collapsed. Without bronze, armies weakened. Without armies, states lost control of territory. Each failure accelerated the next. Written records from this period capture confusion rather than clarity. Letters from Ugarit request grain and military aid. The tone is urgent but not explanatory. Officials do not describe systemic failure. They describe immediate need. The collapse appears sudden only because the final alignment happens quickly. The Roman Empire shows a slower convergence. Climate variability reduced agricultural output in some regions. Population pressure strained land. Tax revenue declined. To compensate, the state increased taxation and regulation. These measures reduced economic flexibility. Trade contracted, coinage debased. Trust in institutions weakened. None of these alone would have ended the empire. Together, they reduced resilience. Archaeological evidence from late Roman provinces shows overlapping indicators: declining villa economies, reduced long-distance trade, fortification of towns, simplification of material culture. Writing persists, but administrative reach shrinks. The system continues to function in form while losing substance. One key feature of tipping points is synchronization. When failures occur at different times, societies recover between shocks. When they occur together, recovery space disappears. Drought, coinciding with political unrest and trade disruption, creates conditions where every response worsens another problem. In the Maya lowlands, prolonged drought coincided with population density at its peak. Agricultural systems were already stretched. Elite competition intensified. Monument building continued, consuming labor and resources. When water scarcity persisted across multiple decades, political legitimacy eroded, warfare increased, trade networks weakened. The system unraveled from several directions at once. Archaeology shows that collapse often accelerates rapidly at this stage. Settlement abandonment increases sharply. Writing ceases within decades. This speed contrasts with the long build-up of stress. Tipping points compress time. One reason tipping points are irreversible is that recovery mechanisms depend on the systems already failing. Rebuilding irrigation requires labor and coordination. Re-establishing trade requires surplus and security. Restoring belief requires visible success. When all are compromised, recovery stalls. Institutions also lag behind reality. Laws, tax systems, and administrative rules reflect earlier conditions. When environments change quickly, institutions become misaligned. Attempts to enforce outdated rules generate resistance rather than stability. Archaeological evidence shows increased signs of unrest just before collapse, including destruction layers and fortification. Tipping points are often accompanied by loss of trust. People withdraw participation from systems that no longer deliver benefit. Tax evasion increases. Trade shifts to informal channels. Local leaders replace distant ones. These actions are rational individually but destructive collectively. Once participation falls below a threshold, systems cannot function. Environmental feedback loops intensify collapse. Abandoned fields erode. Canals silt up. Infrastructure decays rapidly without maintenance. Archaeologists often note that post-collapse landscapes are harder to reuse than pre-collapse ones. The cost of restarting exceeds available capacity. Disease can act as an accelerant. Malnutrition weakens immunity. Crowded conditions facilitate spread. While epidemics rarely initiate collapse, they amplify stress at tipping points. Skeletal evidence from late phases often shows combined signs of starvation and infection. One striking pattern is that elites often persist longer than common systems. Palaces continue operating while hinterlands empty. Monumental construction may continue briefly even as population declines. This creates an illusion of stability. Collapse appears abrupt when elite structures finally fail. Archaeology rarely shows attempts at comprehensive reform during tipping points. Instead, societies fragment. Regions adapt independently. Some areas stabilize at lower complexity. Others empty out. The unified system dissolves. Tipping points also explain why civilizations do not return quickly when conditions improve. Even if rainfall increases or conflict subsides, the integrated system is gone. Knowledge networks are broken. Trade routes are abandoned. Population is dispersed. Recovery would require rebuilding multiple systems simultaneously. Later societies often misinterpret these collapses as moral failures or sudden disasters. The material record suggests otherwise. Collapse is the end of a long convergence, not the beginning. The concept of a tipping point helps explain why warning signs are often ignored. Each problem has been managed before. What is new is their alignment. Humans are skilled at addressing isolated challenges. They struggle with systemic interaction. Archaeological timelines show that once tipping points are crossed, change becomes directional. Simplification replaces complexity. Local replaces global. Short-term replaces long-term. These shifts are adaptive, under constraint, but prevent reversal. Collapse, at this stage, is not a single event. It is a loss of options. Choices narrow until only contraction remains. What follows is not chaos everywhere, but reorganization at smaller scales. The ground preserves this moment as a thinning. Fewer buildings, shorter trade distances, reduced artifact diversity. Writing ends. The silence that follows is not emptiness. It is the sound of systems no longer speaking to each other. Civilizations end not when the first pressure appears, but when the last margin disappears. Tipping points mark that disappearance. What remains afterward is human life continuing under altered limits, carrying memory without the systems that once managed it. Why rebuilding starts small instead of restoring what was lost? After collapse, societies do not return to their previous form. This is one of the most consistent patterns in archaeology. Even when people remain in the same region, even when land recovers and conflict subsides, rebuilding does not aim to restore earlier complexity. It begins with simpler systems. The reasons are structural, not cultural. Complex civilizations depend on interlocking systems. Administration, trade, infrastructure, belief, population density, and knowledge transmission must all function together. When collapse occurs, these systems do not fail evenly. Some disappear entirely, others persist in weakened form. Rebuilding requires all of them at once, yet none can be restored independently. Archaeological layers following collapse show immediate reoccupation of land, but not cities. People return to fields before they return to administration. Food production resumes before record keeping. Shelter appears before infrastructure. This sequence reflects necessity. Survival systems come first, coordination systems come later, if at all. One reason rebuilding remains limited is demographic dispersion. After collapse, populations are spread out. Cities empty. Specialists vanish. Density drops below the threshold needed to support complex roles. A scribe, engineer, or surveyor requires surplus and institutional backing. Small communities cannot support such specialization. Knowledge becomes generalized. In post-late Bronze Age Greece, farming villages reappeared quickly, pottery production resumed, metalworking continued. At a basic level, writing did not return for centuries. There was no institutional need for record keeping at village scale. The palace economy that required it no longer existed. This pattern repeats in Roman Europe. After imperial authority faded, agriculture persisted. Trade became local. Roads were used but not maintained at scale. Law shifted from written codes to customary practice. Latin survived as speech, but literacy declined. Rebuilding focused on what could be sustained locally. Infrastructure presents another barrier. Large systems decay rapidly without maintenance. Aqueducts collapse. Canals silt up. Roads erode. Rebuilding them requires coordinated labour, technical knowledge, and surplus resources. These are the very elements lost during collapse. Archaeological evidence shows that even when Roman aqueducts remained visible, medieval communities rarely repaired them. They built wells instead. Belief systems also change after collapse. The ideologies that justified previous authority often lose credibility. New belief frameworks emerge that emphasize humility, endurance, or local identity. These systems do not support large centralized projects. They favor continuity of life rather than restoration of scale. In early medieval Europe, Christianity provided cohesion without requiring imperial administration. Monasteries preserved limited literacy and craft knowledge. Yet their focus was spiritual continuity, not reconstruction of Roman logistics. The belief system aligned with smaller scale organization. Rebuilding is further constrained by memory gaps. Survivors may remember that something existed, but not how it functioned. Children grow up without exposure to complex systems. Skills that require decades of apprenticeship disappear within 1 or 2 generations. Even if materials are available, methods are not. Archaeology shows repeated imitation without understanding. Later builders reuse foundations, mimic styles, or repurpose materials. Stone from earlier monuments is incorporated into new structures. The form survives, the function does not. This reuse is efficient, not restorative. Economic incentives also discourage restoration. Large systems require long-term investment with delayed returns. Post-collapse societies prioritize immediate resilience. Small fields, diversified crops, and local exchange reduce risk. Large projects increase vulnerability. The memory of collapse reinforces this caution. Trade networks do not reappear easily. Trust must be rebuilt. Routes must be secured. Surplus must exist on both ends. Archaeological evidence shows that long-distance trade often resumes centuries after collapse, and in different forms. New routes replace old ones. Old hubs are bypassed. Political authority faces similar constraints. Centralized power requires legitimacy and enforcement. After collapse, authority fragments. Local leaders gain trust because they are present. Distant authority is viewed with suspicion. Attempts to re-centralize often fail unless conditions stabilize across generations. The Carolingian Empire illustrates this limitation. It attempted to revive Roman-style administration in Western Europe during the 8th and 9th centuries. While some coordination returned, it relied heavily on personal loyalty rather than institutions. After its fragmentation, no sustained imperial system remained. The structural foundation was insufficient. Rebuilding also interacts with environment. Post-collapse landscapes differ from pre-collapse ones. Soil erosion, forest regrowth, and altered water systems change what is possible. Agricultural patterns shift. Settlements relocate. Restoration of old layouts may no longer make sense. In the Indus region, urban centres were not rebuilt after abandonment. Instead, rural villages expanded. The environment favoured dispersed settlement under altered monsoon patterns. Urban planning was not attempted again for centuries. Knowledge preservation occurs unevenly. Some techniques survive in isolated pockets, others vanish completely. This uneven survival shapes rebuilding paths. New systems form around what remains, not what is remembered. Archaeological timelines show that complexity returns gradually, often in new forms. Writing reappears differently. Architecture adopts new materials. Governance evolves along altered lines. This is not recovery in the sense of restoration, it is reassembly under new constraints. One important factor is generational turnover. People who lived under the old system die. New generations normalize simpler life. The motivation to restore disappears. What was once loss becomes baseline. Memory turns into legend. This explains why ruins often inspire myth rather than reconstruction. Stonework appears mysterious. Scale seems excessive. Builders are imagined as giants or gods. The practical reality is that the supporting systems no longer exist. Rebuilding small also allows experimentation. Local systems adapt independently. Some succeed, others fail. Over time, successful patterns spread. This bottom-up process differs fundamentally from top-down restoration. Archaeology shows that new civilizations often differ markedly from those that preceded them, even in the same region. The archaeological record does not support the idea of inevitable progress. It shows cycles of expansion, collapse, and reorganization. Each restart begins with what can be sustained immediately. Complexity is earned slowly. Civilizations restart small because survival demands it. Restoration requires conditions that no longer exist. Simpler systems function under uncertainty. Larger ones do not. What follows collapse is not emptiness, it is continuity without coordination. Life persists, systems shrink. Over time, new forms emerge that reflect altered limits rather than past ambition. This process explains why civilizations begin again, but never where they ended. The ground remembers the past, but rebuilding listens to the present. Why continuity is rare and restart is the pattern. Across long stretches of time, archaeology reveals a quiet regularity. Civilizations emerge, expand, thin, and reorganize. This rhythm appears regardless of geography, culture, or technology. It is not limited to ancient societies. It is a structural feature of how complex human systems behave over time. What stands out is not how often civilizations collapse, but how rarely they maintain continuity. Sustained complexity across millennia is uncommon. Breaks, gaps, and resets dominate the record. Writing disappears, cities empty, skills narrow, new systems form that resemble what came before, only in fragments. Continuity requires more than survival. It requires uninterrupted transmission of knowledge, stable environments, resilient institutions, and adaptable belief systems. Each of these is vulnerable on its own. Maintaining all of them together across centuries is difficult. Maintaining them across millennia is rarer still. Archaeology shows that even when populations persist in place, continuity can fail. People remain on the land, but the systems that once organized them do not. This distinction matters. Collapse does not mean disappearance. It means loss of coordination at scale. One reason continuity is fragile is that complexity accumulates unevenly. Systems grow by adding layers. Administration expands. Infrastructure extends. Specialization deepens. Each layer increases efficiency, but also increases dependency. Over time, the system becomes harder to adjust. Small disruptions propagate widely. What once absorbed shock begins to amplify it. Environmental stability is one such requirement. Long periods of predictable climate support, agriculture, surplus, and planning. Archaeological records show that many civilizations emerged during stable climatic windows. When those windows closed, systems built for stability struggled to adapt. Climate variability did not need to be extreme. Small shifts, sustained over time, were enough to erode margins. Resource availability is another condition. Early abundance allows growth. Later depletion constrains it. Even renewable resources require management. Soil, forests, and water recover slowly. Civilizations often expand faster than renewal allows. When limits are reached, contraction follows. Trade networks add both resilience and risk. They allow regions to compensate for local scarcity, but they create dependency on distance. When trade falters, systems that relied on external inputs simplify quickly. Archaeology repeatedly shows contraction of trade, preceding or accompanying collapse. Centralized authority increases coordination but reduces flexibility. Decisions made far from local conditions lag behind change. Attempts to preserve order through rigidity often accelerate failure. Once trust in central systems erodes, participation declines. Without participation, authority becomes symbolic. Belief systems hold societies together across time. They explain why systems exist and why they should endure. Yet belief systems are slow to change. They form around success and persist into failure. Archaeology shows that ideology often intensifies as material conditions worsen. Ritual increases. Orthodoxy hardens. Adaptation is delayed. Population growth adds pressure that is difficult to reverse. Infrastructure, land use, and social expectations assume expansion. When carrying capacity is reached, reduction occurs unevenly. Migration, inequality, and disease follow. Population decline is a symptom of systemic overload rather than its cause. Knowledge transmission is one of the most fragile elements. Skills require institutions, density, and continuity. When these falter, knowledge narrows quickly, writing disappears. Engineering simplifies. Techniques are forgotten within generations. Even when material conditions recover, lost knowledge prevents restoration. Trauma reshapes behavior long after danger passes. Societies that experience collapse reorganize around caution. Defense replaces openness. Local trust replaces distant coordination. These adaptations stabilize life under uncertainty, but limit scale. Memory of collapse influences choices for centuries. These pressures rarely act alone. Archaeology shows them converging. Climate stress interacts with resource depletion. Population pressure amplifies inequality. Centralization responds with rigidity. Belief delays reform. Trade dependency magnifies disruption. When alignment occurs, systems lose options. What follows is not chaos everywhere. It is reorganization at smaller scales. People adapt locally. They farm, trade, and govern within reduced horizons. Complexity does not vanish. It fragments. This fragmentation explains why continuity is rare. To preserve a civilization intact, every supporting system must remain functional or adaptable simultaneously. The probability of this decreases with time. The longer a system persists, the more likely it is to encounter misalignment. Archaeology also shows that restarts are not failures, they are responses. Simpler systems function under constraint. They require less coordination. They tolerate variability. They allow experimentation. Over time, some of these experiments accumulate into new complexity. Yet the new complexity is never identical to the old. Writing returns in different forms. Architecture adopts new materials. Governance follows altered logic. Memory of the past survives as myth, ruin, or reference, not as blueprint. This pattern challenges the idea of linear progress. The archaeological record does not support a steady ascent. It shows repeated rebuilding shaped by limits rather than ambition. Each civilization begins again because the conditions that supported the previous one no longer exist. Continuity does occur briefly. Some systems persist longer than others. Egyptian civilization maintained recognizable structures for thousands of years, yet even it experienced resets, decentralizations, and transformations. What appears continuous is often a series of adaptations layered over breaks. The ground preserves these breaks as silence, gaps in writing, changes in settlement, simplified tools. These absences are not empty. They mark transitions where systems could no longer sustain themselves. Modern observers often search for single explanations: a disaster, an invasion, a mistake. Archaeology resists this simplification. Collapse emerges from interaction. Restart emerges from necessity. The final pattern is consistent. Civilizations grow by accumulating complexity. Complexity increases vulnerability. Vulnerability invites contraction. Contraction resets scale. From that scale, new systems emerge. This does not imply inevitability in a moral sense. It reflects structural limits. Human societies are capable of adaptation, but not infinite coordination. Scale amplifies both success and failure. Continuity, when it appears, is an anomaly shaped by rare alignment of conditions. Restart is the default response when alignment breaks. The archaeological record ends not with endings, but with beginnings that follow silence. Each restart carries less memory, fewer tools, and narrower reach. Yet it also carries resilience, shaped by experience. Civilizations do not forget because they choose to. They restart because memory itself requires systems that no longer exist. What remains is not loss, but transformation repeated across time. The cycle persists because it reflects how humans organize under limits. The ground does not record intention, it records outcome. And across regions and ages, the outcome is clear. Civilizations begin again not because they fail to learn, but because learning itself depends on structures that time eventually erodes. Restart is not the exception. It is the pattern written quietly into human history. If this documentary helped you see history differently, consider subscribing to the channel. New long-form documentaries explore forgotten patterns, lost systems, and the quiet forces shaping civilization. Like the video if you want more chapters like this, and leave a comment with the next topic you want explored.